Is Richard Marlink. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard AIDS Institute and one of the co-sponsors for tonight's showing. Thanks for coming. Before I introduce Richard Pepler, Senior Vice President of HBO, who's made this possible, I'd like to say a few words about Harvard and Harvard AIDS Institute's, I guess, relationship or connection to Arthur Ashe. In today's Harvard Gazette, I read, as maybe some of you who might read the Gazette, I don't know, I read about the Harvard Radcliffe Convocation, which traditionally occurs to welcome first-year students to Harvard. And a Harvard graduate from 1976, that's a recent graduate for those of us that graduated in 1976, a Harvard graduate from 1976 was the valedictorian speaker, and Esmeralda Santiago went into talking to these leaders in training, if you will, the new Radcliffe and Harvard students just a few days ago. And really talking about leaders in training, she, tongue-in-cheek, made up 5 rules that were what she called Esmeralda's 5 rules to avoid taking on responsibility. I guess talking about the decade of the 70s, the decade of the me decade, the 80s, the get-ahead decade. We don't know yet about the 90s, but I think tongue-in-cheek she made up rules about how to avoid taking on responsibility. And let me just read those rules to you. First, never volunteer for anything. People who volunteer are thought to be confident in their abilities. Second, don't ask questions. People who ask questions are thought to be paying attention to what's going on. Before you know it, people will be asking you questions. Third, never let on that you know how to do that or whatever it is. If you do, those who don't know will expect you to teach them. People who can teach are expected to be leaders. Fourth, never use any big words. Words like race, culture, society, identity. People think you've thought about them and will ask your opinion about these issues, and they may have never entered your mind. And lastly, when in new situations with uncertain outcome or leadership, always stand with other people around you and never stand alone by yourself. Well, as we know, Arthur Ashe did not follow these 5 rules to avoid taking on responsibility. We first had contact with Arthur Ashe when he actually volunteered. He broke the first rule. At the medical school in 1992, unexpectedly, the convocation or the commencement speaker, like Esmeralda Santiago, the commencement speaker canceled out, and the day before the speech, and Arthur Ashe called up out of the blue and volunteered to the Assistant Dean of Student Affairs. I heard you have a problem. I read about it in the paper. Do you think I can help? He was the commencement speaker for that year at the medical school. Since then, and for those that knew Arthur Ashe, he constantly asked questions. He broke that rule constantly. He was a teacher, and his thoughtful, quiet, living by example really broke the 4th rule and all these rules by being an example for all of us. Obviously, he was a leader, breaking the 5th rule, and the Harvard AIDS Institute commended him with awarding our AIDS Leadership Award, which we do every World AIDS Day in 1992, just shortly before his death. So I have not seen this film, but I commend HBO. We've been very excited about many of the projects actually that have come up here from HBO in the last couple years. And I commend Richard and really the whole organization in making this film. I look forward to seeing it. And without further ado, I'd like to have Richard say a few words.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to the Institute of Politics and my friend Steve Singer. We've done many terrific events here. It's nice to be back. You're in for, I think, a treat tonight. This is a very special film. We've shown it around the country to a variety of different audiences. I should tell you that we did a screening around the time of the U.S. Open for many of Arthur's former colleagues. And the response of that group of people who came of age with Arthur was remarkable. There was not, first of all, a dry eye in the house, as there will not be tonight when you see this, but people who hadn't had contact with him for a long time, you could see in their faces and in their expressions that they were brought back to the dignity and the quality of this individual. He had a remarkable capacity. There were many people at HBO, Seth Abraham, who's our president of HBO Sports and the president of Time Warner Sports, who knew him very well and worked with him. He did Wimbledon with us for 10 years. He announced that he had AIDS publicly in our headquarters in New York. So there was a great personal attachment to the man from the people who made this film, and I think you'll see that reflected tonight. We showed the film Tuesday evening in Washington. It was hosted by Ron Brown, Secretary of Commerce, and by Senator Bradley, people who have busy schedules and who don't ordinarily show up to screenings, but they were there, and they were obviously there for Arthur and for what he represented to them. So we're proud to bring the film here, and I hope that you will find it as compelling and moving and inspirational as those who have seen it so far have. And I appreciate your taking the time to join us tonight. Thank you. Enjoy the film.
The following is a special presentation of HBO Sports.
A beautiful black man in beautiful white clothes playing and integrating a beautiful and utterly white game and winning.
In a way, he symbolized a kind of humanity that brought people together.
He was an ambassador of what was right. He was an ambassador of dignity. He was an ambassador of class. He was an ambassador of African Americans. He was an ambassador of so many things. That's what I think Arthur's calling was, and I think that's who he was.
We realized that the world had to come together for us to have a future. His favorite T-shirt was, "I'm a citizen of the world."
He was a model of a man for our times. Whoever we were, whatever we were proud to say Arthur Ashe was one of us.
I don't want is to be thought of, when all is said and done, as a great tennis player. I mean, that's no contribution to make to society, because that is purely selfish. I did it for me. I haven't helped anybody else by winning Wimbledon, the U.S. Open. But now if I could discover some new vaccine for sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis, now that's what a role model should be.
He was a black man in a white man's world, playing a white man's game in white folks' country clubs, coping with race and class every day of his life. Arthur was able to take this burden of race and wear it as a cloak of dignity.
Arthur grew up in one harsh, segregated society, and then came to maturity in another, altogether different culture, one that was elite, white, and comfortable, but a society that was still, in its own way, every bit as separate and unequal. When Arthur was born in 1943, Richmond, Virginia, the very capital of the Confederacy, still celebrated its Civil War heroes. General Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, and General Stonewall Jackson. Former Governor of Virginia, Douglas Wilder, remembers that even with the Supreme Court mandate when Arthur was 11, change came grudgingly to Virginia.
Desegregation really didn't come about until Brown versus Board of Education, May 17, 1954. And so from 1954 to 1957, there was great turmoil. And that's when you had the closings of the schools, rather than to follow the dictates of the Supreme Court decision in May of 1954. There was tenseness in the air. There were people in parts of the state threatening to do violence if there was going to be this integration, and people were predicting mongrelization of the races and desecration of the political system as we knew it.
Arthur's aunt, Dot Cunningham, remembers vividly one of his first encounters with segregation, something so strange and irrational to a child.
My sister and his mother got on the bus. There were not any places for them to sit because you knew that you were not to sit at the front of the bus. Arthur Jr. asked this white man to get up and give his mother a seat. Now he's little. His mother died when he was 6. And the man told him, if you have the nerve to ask me to get up and give your mother a seat, I'm going to give her my seat. And he got up so as my sister could sit down. At that particular time, you would have to understand what was going on here at that time. That is amazing.
In 1947, Jackie Robinson made his entrance into the major leagues and became instantly the hero of Black America. Arthur was just 4 years old.
Like any kid then, black kid in particular, we all wanted to be Jackie Robinson. Yeah. We wanted to wear 42, play second base, and play for the Brooklyn Dodgers. My father wouldn't let me play football. I played baseball. I was a very good baseball player. My father was the caretaker of the largest playground for blacks in Richmond, Virginia. And the house came with the job on the playground. And 4 tennis courts were just 10 yards away, literally. Growing up, I believe the first big hurdle that I overcame was bouncing back from rejection I experienced when I was 12, when my coach took me to Byrd Park in Richmond, Virginia to try to enter me into a sanctioned USTA tournament. And the gentleman there said no, you couldn't play. And I couldn't play, and purely because I was black. And I think in some quiet but effective way that encouraged me to adopt the attitude of, well, I'll show them.
Donald Dell, an older player, became Arthur's Davis Cup captain, his lawyer, and one of his closest friends.
When I first met Arthur, he was playing in Charlottesville at the National Scholastics, and that was a major breakthrough to have an integrated tennis tournament there. And there's, the very painful story where he went to the movies with 5 or 6 people in the tournament. He was only probably 11, 12, 13 years old, and he can't get in the movies. The people turned him down at the movies, and I'm sorry, no blacks are allowed in the movies.
Bob Davis was a black junior player from New York City. He played junior tournaments all over the East Coast with Arthur, but his trips to the South were sadly the most memorable.
I remember one particular incident in which Arthur and I were staying in a YMCA, and in the middle of the night, somebody put a fire axe right through the panel on our door. And really, the message was, go away, but we stayed. Tennis did not embrace us early.
At that time, most black junior tennis players grew up competing in American Tennis Association tournaments because black players were excluded from segregated U.S. Lawn Tennis Association events. The ATA ran its own events and helped support the most promising young black players. Virginia Glass was a member of the Junior Development Committee.
It was a matter of literally asking people for money to support these people. The money came in $10, $5, $1, whatever you could afford to give to keep Arthur going. How did Arthur do was the question of the day. We had a network of people, of clubs, so whenever a junior would go to a particular town, we would call and say, he's coming to, let's say, Los Angeles. Can you keep him? So there was a tremendous amount of family feeling and reciprocity among the members of the ATA.
The sport the young Ashe moved into in the early 60s was sophisticated, international, upper class. Not only were all the trappings white, the shirts, the pants, the shoes, and the balls, but so was most everybody watching and most everybody playing. In that world, Arthur Ashe always stood out.
When I was younger, I hated being branded this way, but it's just your physical characteristics are the first thing that people notice about you, and the fact that my skin is brown, my hair is a certain way, what have you, you can't get away from it. So you have to accept it. And when people look at me, he's a Negro before anything else. That's the way it is. But now it's, well, it's almost like money in the bank for me now in a way. I'm a drawing card, whether I like it or not. And the fact that I am Negro makes it that way. So I say, why not capitalize on it?
Writer and friend, Frank DeFord.
He was at ease. He was at peace with himself, but he was smart enough to understand that he was a novelty. And later on, he was smart enough to understand that he could use this difference to make a difference.
If I were to blow up, they'd say, well, look what that Negro's doing. You know, that's just typical, you know. People like to generalize from specific examples about Negro behavior. They think if one Negro does a certain thing, then all Negroes are that way. But these people are the uninformed. They're probably jealous, or they have some other grudge. So you walk about 3 or 4 different tipropes at the same time.
You were never told, well, this is what you've got to accept the rest of your life. We were told that, hey, you're going to have to be better than whites. You're going to have to try twice as hard.
Arthur was flashy and stylish on the ATA circuit, but he later became famous for his impeccable court manners. No one can remember ever seeing him lose his composure. That demeanor Arthur had learned from his tennis mentor, Dr. R.W. Johnson. Out of his rambling old house in Lynchburg, Virginia, Dr. Johnson ran a summer tennis camp. His goal was not only to produce champion black tennis players, but to produce boys and girls who could be champions for their race as well. Arthur's Aunt Dot remembers.
There was a time that we blacks in the South knew if we wanted to get ahead, we had to be better than the rest of them. Because if we were going to be accepted at all, that's the basis we were going to be accepted on. And Dr. Johnson instilled that in him. And he knew that he couldn't act like the rest of them. He had to carry himself in a respectable manner. Because now his daddy wouldn't have accepted anything else either. But Dr. Johnson reinforced it.
Virginia Glass's 2 sons, Sidney and Louis, attended Dr. Johnson's camp with Arthur. Sidney spent several summers there.
Growing up as someone from the North, it was just a very frightening experience for me to go south and live in this town called Lynchburg. It seemed like, Jesus, what kind of name is this for a place? And Dr. Johnson was sort of this very omnipotent person who seemed to be in control of everything. And we were like really scared of him and kind of in awe of him. We would play tennis all day on his tennis court, and we would practice and practice. And then on the weekends, we would get into this big old car. It was an Electra 225. They call it a deuce and a quarter. It was one of these cars that was supposed to be symbolic of making it back then. And we would traipse from tournament to tournament on the weekends. There were no black kids playing in any tournaments at all. Basically, every time we played in a, quote, white tennis tournament, it was not just a tennis match, it was also, sort of a minor civil rights struggle going on a lot of times, because it seemed as if all the white kids could act like total brats, and we always had to act perfectly. Dr. Johnson has basically said, you are here, you are representing the American Tennis Association, you are representing Negroes, because we were Negroes then, and that we had to act as young men and young ladies. It was kind of a real handicap to be playing in a tournament and have this burden or this weight of being this sort of racial representative and having to be, goody-goody, and at the same time trying to beat the heck out of somebody. Arthur, from when he was 14, was pretty amazing in terms of just being able to cope. He was so good so soon that he was always the one black person who was sent here and there, and he was afforded a number of tremendous opportunities, and with those opportunities came the price, that he had to really act as the consummate sportsman. Arthur, since he was a kid, was an ambassador, just had a real presence. Had a presence even when he wore those really creepy-looking glasses.
By the time Arthur was 28, he had played tennis virtually everywhere in the world, except for one place, Africa. He was growing more curious to return to the continent his ancestors had been forced to depart in 1735. Ashe's first trip came on a State Department tour in 1971. Writer Frank DeFord accompanied him.
Arthur was a wonderful representative of the United States. Arthur could tell you years later the politics of Tanzania or Zambia or Zaire or whatever. I mean, he became as much of an expert on Africa as he was on anything else. I think he felt a little more complete that he had gone to Africa.
We stand on the eve of a black revolution, brothers.
By any means necessary. I'm tired of war and conflict in the world. I'm tired of shooting. I'm tired of hate. I'm tired of selfishness. I'm tired of evil. I'm not going to use violence, no matter who says it.
Black unity was a powerful emerging force in the 1960s. Thousands united behind a new charismatic leadership devoted to the battle against racism. Blacks responded to the conflict with passion and rage, even violence, demanding their rights and their dreams. 1968, the year America imploded. The Vietnam War, the assassinations, the whole nation rent asunder. In sports, black athletes pondered how to use the Olympics in Mexico City to express their grievances to the world. Arthur, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, remained quiet in his support. For the first time, he was suffering concentrated criticism that his interest had fallen too much into the white world where tennis had taken him. Dr. Harry Edwards was the driving force behind the Olympic boycott. He had called upon Lieutenant Ashe to come out in support of their protest.
Surely, this young man with this big afro hairdo and all of the tensions that he must encounter in these lily white country club settings must have some sympathies or sentiments with what we were trying to do, because after all, if we were this upset, he must be doubly upset And by that time, it was very clear that we were planning a boycott of the 1968 Olympic Games. And we were essentially asking for his support, not asking him really to boycott anything. His basic response was that, I understand what you're saying, and I think that probably for you, that's a creditable stance to take, but that's not my way. My first reaction was, well, I'll be damned. Arthur Ashe is an Uncle Tom. But then as things went along and he began to speak out, I really came to respect what he called his way. I not only came to respect it, I came to depend on it.
He had the soul of a revolutionary.
Donald Dell.
But he approached things differently. He wasn't a yeller, he wasn't a screamer, he wasn't a rabble-rouser. That was never Arthur. But underneath that quiet, intellectual facade, was a raging heart who was disappointed. And that bothered him a lot.
And suddenly, dramatically, the summer of that year, Ashe began to play the best tennis of his life. The black lieutenant would lead the United States to its first Davis Cup triumph in 5 years. He became the #1 player in the world and the first black man to win a Grand Slam title as he captured the very first U.S. Open. Arthur shared the emotion with his father. So much is heard now about the deteriorating African-American family, about children adrift, lost, without guidance. The Ashes and the Cunninghams, though, had been the most solid of families.
You learn that, especially in the South, in the black church when I was growing up. The black community all lived in one place, and we sort of supported one another. There were terrific role models that I came in contact with all the time. But I think the most important thing was that you keep a very good reputation. Your name was worth more than diamonds and gold, as they say.
Arthur's Aunt Dot recalls,
Arthur was sensitive enough to know that his father had made great sacrifices for him to play tennis. I mean, financial sacrifices. Black people, non-professionals, didn't make a lot of money then. Because now his dad stayed in good with the wealthy white people around here. He worked for them. This was extra. And he would do that to try to take care of his family, like all young black men did at that time.
My father was a very stern taskmaster. Even up until my late 20s and 30s, I had the feeling that if I got out of line, my father would kick my ass.
Arthur's father often traveled to Davis Cup matches. Donald Dell learned what Arthur Sr. meant to his son.
I think his father had the single biggest influence, by far, of anybody in his life, in the sense of setting his values, setting his goals, setting his dreams. His father always told him, turn the other cheek, the ball's close, call it in, trust people rather than not trusting them. If you tell somebody you're going to do something, you do it. If you tell somebody you're going to be somewhere at a certain time, you're there. All those kinds of values that Arthur lived his whole life by were from his father. And he was a very strict disciplinarian. I mean, he would say to Arthur, you got 6 minutes to get home from school. If you're here after 7, I'm going to start looking for you.
Sadly, Arthur Sr. had become even more important to Arthur Jr. because at the age of 6, the boy had lost his mother.
I remember that morning very vividly. It was the morning my mother died, and my father was holding my brother and me on opposite sides of him, sitting on the bottom of the bunk bed that my brother and I shared, and he was just crying very uncontrollably and saying, this is all I've got left, this is all I've got left. There was always a rather strong bond between my father, my brother, and me.
Frank DeFord.
He had a wonderful stepmother that he adored. And so that it wasn't that he lacked a mother figure. He lacked a mother. He lacked his mother.
Gaining confidence, the mature Ashe became a leader. In 1973, when the players boycotted Wimbledon, it was the young black man who helped lead the revolt.
What the public and the administration doesn't seem to realize is that we are professional athletes with a mind of our own. You know, you're born of a free will. You can play or you cannot play.
Agreed also.
The 78 players who boycotted wanted freedom from their national federations to pick and choose as individuals the tournaments they wanted to enter.
Ask any member if you like. I think we were pretty strong, and because our cause is right, that's the basis of our decision to withdraw from Wimbledon.
The newly formed union survived and succeeded. Ashe was getting used to dealing with obstacles. The next one, though, was even more substantial.
At Wimbledon, Cliff Drysdale of South Africa tells me that if I wanted to play in the South African Open, I wouldn't be able to play. They don't let whites and blacks play together. And here was a reminiscence of what had happened to me when I was 12. I wasn't going to let that happen to me again.
So Ashe undertook his own delicate and controversial diplomacy. As the Western world continued to exile South Africa, as the country itself was embroiled in turmoil, Arthur decided that he would deal with the devil itself. Playing in the South African Open, Ashe became the first prominent black athlete to force a concession from apartheid. His friend, South African player Ray Moore, gave him counsel about the country's oppressive political system.
Something as important as this, he researched, he agonized. He turned it inside out before he made his decision, and it was a very brave decision to go down there because he was criticized by a lot of people in the black community in the United States for doing that.
In South Africa as well, he faced stiff opposition from groups black and white. Once again, he walked a tightrope. Arthur had made several incendiary statements about South Africa before he went there.
Do you still think that someone should drop a bomb in Johannesburg?
Well, obviously, I really didn't mean that literally when I said it. But I find it very strange. I feel very strange being here. It's a little bit like a fairy tale right now, I guess.
Isn't there some sort of opposition from militant forces overseas against this visit of yours?
Oh, yes. Well, you know, I imagine there are people of all sorts of political persuasions who, some want me to come, some don't care one way or the other, and some really don't want me to come at all. But I'm my own man. I always have been. I make up my own mind, and if anybody wants to debate me on the merits of my coming, I'd be glad to meet them anytime they'd like.
Lifelong friend Charlie Passerell.
He felt that what the whites in South Africa were trying to do is to say that, well, see, we allow black people to compete here. And so they felt that by Arthur playing, that he would in fact be playing into their hand. But little did they know that Arthur was a better poker player than those guys were.
What do you think of playing to segregated audiences?
Well, the audiences here are not segregated.
In the main stand, they are. In the center court.
Well, if I find that they are, I won't be playing.
Yeah.
I understand that it was one of my conditions that I wouldn't play in front of a segregated audience. So if the audiences are segregated, I won't be walking out there.
News of Arthur's determined stand against apartheid even reached Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was in his 9th year of imprisonment.
Arthur was a source of great inspiration to young people because blacks identify with blacks in our situation. And when a black man has reached such a notable success, he becomes far more of an inspiration to blacks than achievements by other national groups.
Arthur Ashe didn't go to Johannesburg simply to play tennis. The fact he reached the finals where he lost to Jimmy Connors is now no more than a footnote. Ashe went to South Africa because he wanted the blacks there to see a free black man, and because he wanted to see apartheid for himself. Tennis organizer Jennifer Williams.
I think my most vivid memory of Arthur is
taking him into Soweto. As we got closer and closer, and as we finally penetrated the circumference and then got into Soweto, he just got quieter and quieter and quieter until he was finally totally silent. And when I asked him what he thought, he just looked at me and shook his head. And as the day drew on and we were supposed to go to Sally McLarner's house for a party, I remember getting into a situation where he was mobbed, almost mobbed. I was quite frightened that the people didn't want to let him go at all. He was a demigod. He was aspirational for them. I guess like nobody else they had ever met in their life.
Mark Matabane was born in one of the most notorious black townships outside of Johannesburg.
It was a life of unending hardship, and it was very depressing to a child. There was no running water, no electricity, no sewage system, only one paved road. I slept on pieces of cardboard under the kitchen table because we couldn't afford a bed. My father was the only breadwinner, and he made about $8 a week, and that money was not enough to keep body and soul together.
Young Matabane learned to play tennis when a white woman gave him an old racket. When Arthur came to South Africa, Mark felt he had to see him.
I met him, or rather saw him, for the first time in 1973. As soon as I set my eyes on him, strangely, tennis became subordinated to something even more powerful. And this is basically the profound realization that this man is the first free black person I'd ever seen. Arthur was black manhood personified, liberated black manhood personified, because he combined intelligence, he was very articulate, he was very confident, especially in front of whites. That was something you never did as a black person unless you were out of your senses. And so it immediately made him, the role model that I had longed for so many years. Most black men of Arthur's caliber were either in exile or languishing in prison like Nelson Mandela, or they were dead. I told myself that maybe if you can gain mastery over this little ball and become as good, as that man you saw, maybe, someday you'd be as free as he was. Because to me the connection was not so much that Arthur was successful as a tennis player, it was that he was free as a tennis player.
Sally McLarner, a prominent Soweto resident, gave a party in Arthur's honor.
That's the day when I said to the people, today God has given us a gift in Africa. And I think we should recognize this by naming Arthur Ashe Sipho a gift. He had come back home, and it was for us to welcome him home, where he belongs.
On the day Ashe left South Africa, a young writer named Don Matera surreptitiously slipped Arthur a poem he had written for him. I listened deeply when you spoke about the step-by-step evolution of a gradual harvest tended by the rains of tolerance and patience. Your youthful face a mask, hiding a pining, anguished spirit, and I loved you, brother, not for your quiet philosophy, but for the rage in your soul, trained to be rebuked or summoned. As for me, when I asked them for bread, they gave me the wheat field, and I thought they loved me. When I asked for water, they gave me the well, and I thought they cared. When I asked for freedom, they took back the wheat field and the well, tightened the chains, and told me I asked too much. Now, I no longer wait for the wheat and the water, but fight for freedom. In 1975, at the advanced tennis age of 31, Arthur Ashe shocked and delighted more than the tennis world by capturing Wimbledon. For this one great match, It was the brilliant student Ashe who stood upon the grass at center court and slayed the young giant, Jimmy Connors.
A group of friends and I assembled at the Playboy Club in London to talk about the strategy for 2 days later. And we basically came to the cold-blooded, hard-headed, realistic conclusion that if I played the way I normally play on grass, I would lose.
Arthur's friend Doug Stein was with him.
He wrote everything down on a little white piece of paper, and in the morning when he got dressed, I was with him in the locker room, he put it under his sock and walked out on the court with it. I guess it must have given him some inner strength that all of the best American tennis minds had given him this plan, and he took it out on the court with him. Needless to say, he never looked at it.
My plan was to hit the ball with as little pace as possible, with a lot of underspin, which means when it hits on a grass court, it's going to skid and stay very low. Hit the ball right down the middle, give him no angles to open up the court, serve him wide on both sides. He's left-handed and he has a two-handed backhand to pull him way off court. To pull him into the net, because he didn't like to come to the net. He was one of the best baseline players the sport's ever seen. And if he did come to the net, try to lob it with underspin over his two-handed backhand side. So going into this, the biggest match I've ever had in my life, I would be forced to play the way I've never played before on a grass court. Having said all that, execution's another problem altogether, but for some reason, everything I tried just worked.
Doug Stein watched from the player's box.
After Arthur put away the final overhead, he turned around to Donald and myself, and he put his fist up in the air, and he was saying, well, guys, I did it.
He's done it. He really has done it.
Bryant Gumbel.
Arthur was supposed to get dismantled. Jimmy Connors at the time was absolutely invincible. And it wasn't just that he beat Jimmy, but it was the fashion in which he beat him, that he clearly beat him with his head, because this wasn't a case of like in a prize fight of a big black brute getting up and demolishing the young white lad. This was clearly a black guy prevailing because he was masterful with his mind.
For me, it was personal satisfaction and vindication that, hey, I mean, I knew right then and there I had tried something I had never tried before on my favorite surface and pulled it off.
With all his professional dreams fulfilled at the age of 33, he married Jean Matusamé. Frankly forward.
Jeannie was the love of his life. She really was the right person at the right time for that guy, and he for her.
Surely an even happier and more exciting life lay ahead. But then...
My worst day ever probably was the day I suffered my heart attack. Yes, that changed my life completely.
On July 31st, 1979, shortly after his 36th birthday, Arthur Ashe suffered without warning a serious heart attack. For the next 14 years, this would be the cruelest joke, that an athlete who had always been so fit would suffer one huge shock after another. His heart problems made him, understandably, preoccupied with his diet, his pace of life, and also, in a certain sense, his mortality. Frankly forward.
I think what that heart attack did to Arthur, more than anything else, is remind him of his mother's early death. I think it had to make him think that he was vulnerable.
Doug Stein.
He started to hear the sounds of death after his first heart attack. We all hear the sounds of death. Some of us just hear them when we're younger than others.
He had been ranked in the top 5 in the world for 13 straight years. Now, life changed its pace, and Arthur changed his focus. He began to explore many new avenues.
One of the biggest but more pleasant surprises of the first week at Wimbledon has been the performance of 18-year-old John McEnroe from New York City, who One of the biggest but more pleasant surprises of the first week at Wimbledon has been the performance of 18-year-old John McEnroe. This being your first trip to Wimbledon, are you surprised at the reaction of the public here?
Well, I mean,
There hasn't been much reaction about me until now, I mean, because I've been playing pretty far back in the court, so that really not too many people know I'm playing.
And then in 1980, the man who had played on more Davis Cup teams than any American in history and owned a 28-6 career singles record was honored further by being named Davis Cup captain. Arthur was blessed to coach the best American tennis talent, but he was sorely tested by John McEnroe, his temperamental opposite.
What I would dearly like, and what I liked in McEnroe, McEnroe had the emotional freedom to be a bad boy. I never had that emotional freedom.
That's going to be a point, doesn't it?
If I had been like that, I'm convinced the tennis world would have drunk me out of it. And my race wouldn't allow me to be like that. And so when I see John going off half-cocked, I'm very irritated at him, and I'm envious. Because I would like to do the same thing, but I don't feel I have that luxury.
However stormy, their relationship was tempered with respect. John McEnroe.
All of a sudden he'd be like, John, and he'd be like almost grabbing at me. You know, it was like I knew that the only way I would get Arthur up was if I questioned a call. So in some sort of sick way, I was probably doing it on purpose, just to get him into it. So I think the reason that Arthur and I developed a lot of respect for each other, because we ended up realizing that we were in the same boat, and that a lot of the way he handled it and the way I handled it was just out of knowing nothing else or being told what to do at a very early age. And so the fact that Arthur kept everything in, I would have the greatest respect for it.
In 1983, Arthur had a second bypass operation. Feeling weak, he received a transfusion of 2 units of blood to jumpstart his road to recovery. After the surgery, he threw himself even more vigorously into activities dear to him. And unlike many retired athletes, Arthur seemed to have more to do in retirement than he had as a player. Always, every day had counted with him. Now, every day must count more. Arthur Ashe began work on his most ambitious project, A Hard Road to Glory. He had always written extensively, and now Ashe, himself one of the most significant African-American athletes of all time, began a 6-year endeavor to write the definitive study of the black athlete. Always, children had been Arthur's dearest concern, especially those trapped in the concrete and crime-infested environment of the inner city, where choices for children are few. And so, Arthur started the Safe Passage program in Newark, New Jersey, designed to keep kids off the streets, to teach them discipline, and above all, to teach them the value of education as a way out. The director of the Safe Passage Foundation is Bob Davis.
Although there are decades separating Dr. Johnson's efforts and the Safe Passage Foundation efforts, they are both programs that step forward to address the problems of our time.
It's a little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
And as the poet Langston Hughes wrote, to sit and learn about the world outside our world of here and now, our problem world. To dream of vast horizons of the soul through dreams made whole, unfettered, free. Help me, all you who are dreamers too, help me to make our world anew. I reach out my dreams to you. For all that he hoped for, it was his daughter who brought the greatest fulfillment to his life, Bryant Gumbel.
The happiest I ever saw Arthur was the night camera came home. We just laughed on into the night, and it was absolutely the happiest I ever saw him. He doted on camera.
Doug Stein.
Camera was really the jewel in Arthur's crown. That completed his life as far as he was concerned. Arthur felt that he had something to give, and camera really was the conduit for what Arthur felt that he had to give. And Arthur was crazy about camera. That was the love of his life.
Tennis great Billie Jean King.
Arthur was remote as a person. Camera tapped into that part of him that he'd never revealed to many of his friends. He just flowed with love for her, but what it did is it spilled over to all of us. Everyone noticed it, how much he changed when camera came into his life.
One of the biggest pleasure scenes that I can experience is seeing my daughter eat chocolate cake and ice cream. There is such a look of unmitigated, open-ended joy at the way she holds the spoon. There is just, that makes my whole day. I now look forward to her eating chocolate cake after dinner.
And then came the discovery in 1988 that he had AIDS. The blood transfusion he had been given 5 years earlier was tainted, HIV positive. By the time he was diagnosed, Ashe already had full-blown AIDS. Doug Stein.
When Arthur found out that he had AIDS, I was in his hospital room at New York Hospital, and he looks to me and he said, "Well, Doug, sometimes life throws you curveballs." I was angry that Arthur had AIDS, but to Arthur, it was just another curveball in the game of life. Truly amazing.
I remember it as if it were yesterday.
Family friend Eddie Mandeville.
When he was told, before the sentence was barely completed, and without even flinching or furrowing his brow, he said, "What does this mean for Jeannie?" At which point Jeannie, who had not been tested, put her arm around him and said, "You and me, babe." And not once, never not once did he question why he had been singled out. He taught me limits of the human spirit that I did not believe possible.
Very few people knew of his condition. Arthur Ashe simply continued to work for others as before. Arthur had become interested in creating better community health care for the vast number of immigrants populating the environs of New York. In the summer of 1992, his friend, Reverend Paul Smith, urged him to visit the SUNY Health Science Center in Brooklyn to deliver his message to the medical community.
We kept trying to set appointments, and he canceled them about 2 or 3 times because there were days he just did not feel well. He also said to us, if I don't feel well, sometimes it passes, so if you come for me at 8, I might not be ready until 10. And as it was, it turned out it's exactly what happened that day.
Despite the fatigue brought on by his disease, Arthur insisted on visiting the children's ward.
People knew that this was Arthur Ashe, the tennis player, but it wasn't an athlete just coming to visit a ward. People wanted to touch him. He took time with people. There was energy when he walked into the room. Even though the kids are a bit lethargic because of their illnesses, Arthur had no difficulty talking to them.
It would be one of the last undertakings he was able to manage. The Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health was launched in December of 1992, just 2 months before his death. He also devoted his precious energy to political activism.
To say that rallies like this are not effective is like saying that continuing to find a cure for cancer, although a cure has not been found, is not worth it. This is worth it.
In 1985, he was arrested for protesting apartheid at the South African Embassy in Washington. Along with actors Gregory Hines and Tony Randall, he organized athletes and artists against apartheid. And only a few months before he died, he was arrested protesting the treatment of Haitian refugees. Worse, he suffered another heart attack, and yet his commitments never wavered. In fact, Arthur never thought his illness was the greatest injustice in his life.
Having to live as a black person in America from day one has been infinitely more challenging and time-consuming, most of it wasteful. If you just imagine all the wasted time in my life that you have to spend just trying to be able to be viewed like everybody else.
The release of Nelson Mandela in 1991, after 27 years of imprisonment, fulfilled one of Arthur's greatest wishes.
I never forget Arthur calling me when Nelson Mandela was released.
South African Ray Moore.
I didn't know. And I was in Hawaii, 6 o'clock in the morning, Hawaiian time. And, still emotional about it. Arthur called me and said, look at the television. Nelson Mandela's released. I couldn't believe it. Arthur found me. I mean, he didn't know I was in Hawaii. I'd gone on a holiday. But he tracked me down because he knew I cared. And it was amazing. And I think we all knew that the minute Nelson Mandela was released, that apartheid would come down.
I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom for all.
In 1991, Arthur returned for one last time to South Africa to see for himself the dismantlement of apartheid. It was one trip Ashe was determined to make before the world found out what had befallen him. And he finally met Mandela the following year.
I had a busy schedule, but I had to postpone some of my appointments to be with a friend because I recognized that he was spending his last day on earth. And it was my duty to give him support, as he had given me support in my own situation, which was not as serious as his.
He really, really admired Mandela.
Donald Dell.
He saw him here in New York when he was fairly sick, but the doctors all said, look, the greatest thing he needs is mental peace of mind, and the busier he is, the happier he is. I mean, you know, here's a guy who has full-blown AIDS, and he was always traveling, always making speeches, always writing, and he used to say to me, look, what do you want me to do, sit home and think about dying of AIDS? He said, I can't do that.
It was to allow more of a typical life with his wife and child that Arthur kept his AIDS a secret from all but family and good friends. Finally, though, after 4 years, on April 8, 1992, the word leaked.
I have known since the time of my brain operation in September 1988 that I have AIDS. And I am truly grateful to all of you, medical and otherwise, who knew but either didn't even ask me or never made it public. What I actually came to feel about a year ago was that there was a silent and a generous conspiracy to assist me in maintaining my privacy. This has meant a great deal to me and Jeannie and Cameron.
Already he had become an expert on AIDS. Now he became an advocate for all who suffered with his disease. He was determined that the AIDS issue be brought to light.
Since I found out I had AIDS, I feel more creative, more productive. I've realized some insights that maybe I may not have realized before. But I also found out that this is not unusual for people who feel that they have less time than they normally would have left.
At the Arthur Ashe Foundation, we're working to help people better understand the truth about AIDS. Because AIDS isn't their problem, it's our problem.
He approached his diseases as a science, or as a game, or as a challenge.
Andrew Young.
Like you've never heard Nelson Mandela be bitter or resent people for putting him in jail for 27 years. You never heard Arthur Ashe say that it shouldn't happen to me, or I didn't deserve this.
Camera had always known her father to be sick. Now she had to be told his sickness had a name.
Certainly, most of the things that I might miss are related to my daughter. I might not see her graduate from high school or her first Holy Communion or get married or see her children or whatever. You think about all those things.
Arthur's governing strength had always been family. His stepbrother Robert remembers the last time he came home to Richmond.
It was the fourth Sunday in August of 1992. We went to the cemetery to visit his mother's gravesite. That's when the grave was not taken care of. It was all bushes, you know. And he just looked around. I guess he just said, well, when I'm buried here, you clean it up. And that was his solid message, you know.
Eddie Mandeville.
You could be very close to Arthur and still not understand all the things that he dreamed about. His energy was boundless, and his commitment to things that he never preached about just continued to stagger me.
There's always hope, and you must live your life as if there is, or there will be some hope. And that hope should not be a selfish hope. That is, for me, the hope is that maybe there's no cure for AIDS in time for me, but certainly for everybody else, and that should be sufficient enough to maintain this hope.
It is a final tribute to the character of a man, of an individual's living, if he can die unshriven, but full-blown as he has lived. Such a man goes down to his grave with a shout. Hallelujah, Arthur Ashe. Hallelujah. God bless you.
This poem, St. Peter relates an incident, was written by James Weldon Johnson. I, Maya Angelou, used excerpts of the poem at a memorial and tribute for Arthur Ashe in Richmond, Virginia. St. Peter said the day came to a close, and heaven, hell too, was filled with them that rose. He shut the pearly gate and turned the key, for time was now merged into eternity. He gave one last look over the jasper wall, and afar described a feature dark and tall, the unknown soldier, dust-stained and begrimed, climbing his way to heaven and singing as he climbed. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Tall black soldier, angel marching alone, swinging up the golden street, saluting at the great white throne, singing, 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 singing.
And as the Bible says, you cry when they come in the world and rejoice when they go out of the world, because they're going to a better place than we have here.
No man has ever loved a family more than Arthur loved his family. No man has ever loved his friends more than Arthur loved his friends. And yes, it can be said that no man loved all humankind more than Arthur did. That gift of love was Arthur's great virtue. And so on this day, I simply want to say to my great friend, goodbye, dear friend. I love you, Arthur.
was slain.